Okay, so just to get started, if you want to introduce yourself, introduce the Alba Solidarity Group, and talk more about the mission of the organization.
Hi, my name's Stan Smith. I work with the Chicago Alba Solidarity that got started after we were once the Chicago Committee to Free the Cuban Five, but after 2014, when they got freed, we worked on defending all the Alba countries, which is Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Bolivia, and before Ecuador. And I put out the AFGJ Venezuela and Alba Weekly for the last like 8 years, giving news about those countries that you can't get in the corporate media here, like what the US is doing to try to overthrow those governments and interfere with their development, and the social accomplishments that the people in the governments there have made over the years.
Excellent. So just to get started on the present subject, I read a little bit of the dispatches on the Cuban and Venezuelan and Nicaraguan response to the crisis in Ukraine. But I'm wondering if you can kind of go more into detail about it for the audience, and then we can discuss more about what the implications will be if the conflict escalates further.
I could give a kind of a summary or excerpts of what they said in their statements. Would that help?
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
All right. There was recently a meeting in the UN about emergency session on Ukraine. So I can read some of the excerpts from the Venezuelans and the Cubans. The Venezuela said, we defend international law and a peaceful settlement of the conflict in the Ukraine. We agreed to the Minsk agreements. The Minsk agreements, that's MINSK, were the agreements to have a ceasefire in the Russian areas of the Ukraine that were being attacked by these neo-Nazi military groups that are in the part of the Ukraine that the US supports. So he said, we agreed to the Minsk agreements. Unfortunately, Ukraine did not abide by it. NATO pressured Ukraine and escalated the conflict and threatened Russia. Now it is escalating into a conflict between nuclear powers. Destabilizing a nuclear power is not the path to peace. We should de-escalate tensions and not fuel them. We reject the application of sanctions and coercive measures. We encourage direct talks between NATO and Russia, and we must end the war propaganda. President Maduro at Venezuela has also made his own statements in interviews, saying that Venezuela will maintain all economic relations with Russia. Said economic warfare is the method used by imperialism to destroy Russia prior to its objective of militarily surrounding the country and thereby breaching all signed agreements. Despite the empire's attempt to impose itself with the blackmail of the dollar and financial and commercial system to impose a unilateral world, a multipolar world of new poles of power has been born. The conflict, Russia began the military operation in the Ukraine on February 24th at the request of the People's Republic of Donetsk and Lugansk to repel the aggression of Kiev, the government in Ukraine, that had been bombarding this region for more than 8 years, resulting in 14,000 people being killed, which I would say parenthetically that this is not really reported in the US press at all. This war really did not start on February 24th. It had been going on for a long time,
Right.
and 14,000 people had been killed, Russians.
Mm.
And when Russia refused to, Ukraine refused, and the US refused to negotiate a ceasefire, that's when Russia responded militarily.
Mm.
Then Maduro goes on, I confirmed Venezuela's condemnations of NATO's destabilizing actions. I reiterate a firm disposition in favor of understanding and dialogue as a way to preserve peace. And he just said it's important to counter the campaign of lies and disinformation unleashed by the Western countries, which, as you may know, in Europe now, you cannot access RT or Sputnik, the two Russian news agencies, which if the media here is really reporting what's going on in the Ukraine, then why do they feel they need to censor the news from Russia about what's going on there?
Right. Right.
I could go on a little I could go add some more, some other statement of his, but maybe I should read some of the Cuban statement.
Yeah, some of the Cuban stuff would be interesting.
The other statement was very good. Said the U.S. determination to continue NATO's progressive expansion towards the Russian Federation's borders has brought about a scenario with implications of unpredictable scope, which could have been avoided. United States and NATO's military moves towards region adjacent to the Russian Federation in recent months are well known and were preceded by the delivery of modern weapons to Ukraine, which together constitute a military siege. It is important to make a rigorous and honest examination of the current situation in Ukraine without carefully assessing Russian Federation's just demands of the United States and NATO and the factors that led to the U.S. use of force and non-observance of legal principles and international norms, which Cuba strongly supports and are particularly for small countries an essential resource in resisting hegemony, abuse of power, and injustice. Maybe I didn't read that right. I mean, he's saying we cannot have an honest and rigorous examination of the current state and affairs without considering what the U.S. had done leading up to this to create that situation. Cuba is a country that defends international law and is committed to the Charter of the United Nations. Cuba will always defend peace and oppose the use of force and threats to do so against any state. We deeply regret the loss of innocent civilian lives in Ukraine. The Cuban people have had and continue to have a very close relationship with the Ukrainian people. And I could add parenthetically that a lot of that is when Cuba helped take care of thousands of children around Chernobyl after the nuclear meltdown there in the late 1980s, that they took care of them for very many years. So they established very close relationship with the Ukrainian people. So going on with this Cuban statement, it says, ignoring the well-founded claims made by the Russian Federation concerning security guarantees and concerning security guarantees for decades, and assuming that Russia would remain defenseless in the face of a direct threat to its national security was a mistake. Russia has the right to defend itself. Peace cannot be maintained by mounting sieges or encircling states. Cuba rejects hypocrisy and double standards. It should be recalled that in 1999, the United States and NATO launched a major attack on Yugoslavia, a European country that was fragmented with high cost in human lives in pursuit of geopolitical objectives and disregarding the UN Charter. The US and several of its allies have used force on many occasions. They have invaded sovereign countries to bring about regime change and interfere in the internal affairs of other countries that do not submit to their interests of domination and defending their territorial integrity and independence. The US and NATO are also responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians, which they label as, quote, collateral damage, end quote. Millions of displaced persons and widespread destruction across our planet in their wars of plunder. Daniel Ortega gave a rather long speech at the anniversary of the murder of Augusto Sandino, just before the war started, or the Russian incursion into Ukraine, attack on Ukraine started, where he went into the whole background of what led up to the war. And he's condemned what the US was doing there to provoke this situation. But it's rather long it's rather detailed discussion for the Nicaraguan people about what lay behind what was going to happen. And I also had a quote from Evo Morales from Bolivia, the former president who was overthrown in the US coup, but now his party is back in power. He recently said, NATO is a serious threat to international peace and security. Its record of invasions and aggressions prove it. Now its expansionist attempt is one of the main reasons for the situation in the Ukraine. So those is, I could read some more quotes from Venezuela, but I don't know if you had a question or anything.
Well, yeah, in the taking the totality of the statements from the ALBA group, I think there's a common theme in that they're, as victims of US aggression themselves in these countries, they're very familiar with the encroachment of NATO and what was happening in the lead up, as you were discussing, to the incursion into Ukraine. But how do you think that, in the reverse of it, how do you think that Russia's incursion and it's hard to make predictions, but what do you see as the escalation of NATO, the expansion of NATO into really a global police force? What impact do you think that will have on the nations of ALBA that have already suffered from a lot of US aggression?
Well, the US is, I think, the main concern of the people running the US now is that their control of the world, they're losing it to China and Russia. And they do not want a multipolar world. They want to be the world boss. After collapse of the Soviet Union, the US thought it was the world boss and it could do what it wants. But now China has become too economically powerful, and Russia is still a major military power, and the US is declining economically in relation to China on every continent on the planet, even in Latin America. And that's the US corporate rulers see that as a threat, and they're trying to stop it. And that's what they're doing now in Ukraine is what they are trying, that's part of their plan to try to stop it. And it makes me think that what they are doing now in the Ukraine, using Ukraine to provoke Russia into a war, they might try to do that later using Taiwan to provoke China. But as for NATO, I know country of Colombia, which is a neighbor of Venezuela, which has a low-level border war going on there against Venezuela. It's not a formal member of NATO, but it is I'm not sure what.
Like a NATO designated
an associate or something.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I can't remember what the exact term for it is.
Right.
So and it is Russia and China and also Iran and some extent India that are defending the ALBA countries against the US pressure to try to overthrow them, which US is constant. I mean, US has an economic blockade on Cuba for some 60 years. It has an economic blockade on Venezuela for 5 years or so. And it's going to have more, not yet a full blockade on Nicaragua, but has a lot of sanctions on Nicaragua right now. And the US is constantly trying to remove those governments. And it's also, I mean, the US did organize a coup against the government of Evo Morales in Bolivia, 2019. And now their government is back in power with it, Luis Arce being the president. But the US is still arming groups in Bolivia to try to start some new military actions against that government. So any kind of victory that the US would have in the Ukraine is going to help them overthrow these governments in Latin America. On the other hand, you think that now there are a lot of very neo-colonial governments that were in Latin America maybe 5 years ago that are not there now. So the US is in a weaker position. They have Nicaragua, in Mexico, they have Lopez Obrador, who's even won't impose any sanctions on Russia. He's against that. They have good relations with most of the ALBA countries. There was just a election in Chile, who's not really that friendly with Nicaragua or Venezuela, but they don't kowtow to the United States. We had a progressive government now in Honduras after 10 years after the US coup there, or it's 12 years, I guess. And in the spring this year, and then in the fall this year, there'll be elections in Colombia and Brazil. And if Lula becomes elected president in Brazil and Bolsonaro loses, then that'll be a big defeat for US control in Latin America, because Brazil is a major economic power.
Yeah, and on that note of the kind of waning US hegemony and military hegemony within Latin America, how do you think the fact that Russia has sent military aid to Venezuela, by some reports has, military equipment and personnel in Venezuela, is really scaring the United States? And how do you think there's a potential there for some escalation, and the US is perceiving Russia as being very friendly with a government that the US is actively trying to overthrow, or has tried to overthrow, as recently as 2018, 2019, with their support of Juan Guaido?
Well, I don't know if the Russian aid it's not like when the Soviet Union sent missiles to Cuba. Their aid is helpful in arming the Venezuelan people, but I don't really think it's some kind of threat to the United States, even if the US was going to invade. So US would probably go through Colombia. If they were trying to, they would use Colombians to invade. They'd use a mercenary army to do it, because actual US soldiers on the ground fighting and invading a country in Latin America would make the whole continent blow up. So I think more the aid that China and Russia give Venezuela is that I think they would have sunk. Venezuela would have sunk. The Chavistas would have lost in the elections and been voted out of power without the significant aid of China and Russia in helping to keep the economy working under all the US sanctions. Because, before the sanctions, Venezuela has all the huge amounts of oil, and everything in its oil industry and everything in and out of its oil industry, all its factories, everything, it all came from the US. All the spare parts, everything came from the US. So the US puts a blockade on Venezuela so they cannot buy any spare parts or anything. And I think 1 quarter of Venezuelan oil was sold in the US, that had a made disastrous impact on their economy, that they had to go redo all their equipment for everything with stuff that was not made in the US, it was made in China or Russia. So that was the most important aid that China and Russia gave Venezuela, is to help them survive the economic blockade that the US put on the country. It'd be like the same, like the way the Soviet Union aided Cuba, which Soviet Union hadn't aided Cuba, their government would have collapsed, and maybe, I don't know. I remember once when I was in Cuba, I asked people, did they think Cuba would have survived without the aid of the Soviet Union? They just laughed. He said, well, maybe we'd make it to 1962 or maybe 63, but that's it. So their aid is, their economic support is the main thing that helps them against the US. Plus, I think, the Venezuelan people, like the Cuban people, they've been armed and trained for, they have popular militias with hundreds of thousands of people who are trained to fight in an invasion. So they're pretty well equipped to survive some kind of land attack on their country.
And on that note, with the prospect of invasion, and as you're talking about, an invasion looks very different now nowadays than it had in the past. And I know a lot of commentators and analysts have been thinking about hybrid warfare as the new kind of method of analysis for these situations and what the US is doing. You mentioned the use of mercenaries as like a more frequent than having, Americans in American uniforms going into these nations. So how do you think that this model of hybrid warfare is it's been used in Ukraine? So there's a parallel there of similar method of warfare. But how do you think it's the American hybrid warfare is evolving in Venezuela? We saw activity in Cuba in last summer in a similar kind of vein. So how do you think that's evolving? How do you think that has the potential to escalate with this new crisis?
In relation to the ALBA countries? Or
Yeah, in the ALBA countries.
well, I have to admit, I am surprised how many anti-war people I know swallow the propaganda coming out from the US about Russia. It's like every time the US goes to war, they make up all these stories about why they need to go to war, with Vietnam as well. The North Vietnamese attacked us in Gulf of Tonkin. Then comes out later, well, that never happened. And then what's the other one? Well, Saddam Hussein, he had weapons of mass destruction and he was going to nuke us or something. And then it came out, well, no, that wasn't real. And then the US invaded Afghanistan 2001. They said, well, that's because they're protecting Osama bin Laden. But that was not the case, because the Taliban government said, if you want to, you have charges against Osama bin Laden, we'll turn them over to you, but you haven't provided any evidence that he had anything to do with this. So, well, we're not going to do that until you give us some evidence that he's some way culpable. And I don't know, the endless numbers of wars. Well, all the propaganda around the US instigated all this conflict in Nicaragua in 2018. They were even killing a lot of police officers and civilians. I mean, even killing them and burning them. And people believe that, it was the Sandinistas doing that when they were the ones being killed. And I remember, even, Juan Guaido in Venezuela is held as some kind of Democrat, and his supporters are fighting for democracy, even though I don't know how often, I've seen the video enough times of when they, for example, they took that one black guy and poured gas on him and lit him up and burned him to death, running away down the street on fire. Um, it's kind of amazing that the US government and the media here can, doesn't matter how many times people know they lied in the past about something, they fall for it again. It's kind of shocking. It's like, wow,
Yeah.
when are you going to learn that, you know, when they start a war about something, they're lying to you?
Right.
Um, so I don't know, maybe I digress from your, how it's related to,
Yeah.
it's hard to say, you know, what I know, like an example in Bolivia, when they overthrew the Evo Morales in Bolivia, they invented the whole story that he stole the election
Right.
and he should be removed because he tried to steal the election. Then it came out, no, he never tried to steal it. He won the election.
Right.
Um, but they would always get people who are like, you think are progressive, they fall for this all the time.
Yeah.
It is rather stunning. And I guess war will continue as long as people fall for this kind of media disinformation.
Right.
It's certainly happening now with Russia in the Ukraine. Um, so I don't, that's the main threat I think that these countries face is to US controls not only the world financial system, like the SWIFT system, but they control the world media. And so, and they can control Facebook, all the social media, they
Yeah.
control it. And um, they can manipulate people's opinions. I mean, they really, I mean, like I posted something on Facebook about, because people were holding up, you know, stand up for Ukraine, defend Ukraine with a flag. So I posted up one with two Ukrainian soldiers with a Ukrainian flag with a swastika in the middle of it. And Facebook said that it violated community standards for me to post that. I was like,
Right.
the control, the way they get people to go along with the war, a war, is to control the information that they see, if it's really information.
Right.
And then people will go along with it. And so long as they are not just inherently skeptical of what they are told in the corporate media, the US could stir up any kind of hybrid warfare again against some other country, in any of these countries. It's I mean, and also they are censoring alternative media more and more all the time in the US. So now it's harder to get the actual truth out about stuff, because they know to keep their control over the propaganda, they have to shut down all other sources of news.
Right.
Just like what they're doing in Europe with shutting down the RT and Sputnik News.
Right. And how do you think that this model of disinformation plays a very key role in Cuba and in Venezuela? With a lot of what we've been seeing recently are also examples of that. So, for example, a lot of controlled disinformation about Cuba in the summer of last year. I remember when, you know, the US was trying to project as if there was a coming revolution of some kind. And it plays kind of a similar role to the media narrative about what is happening right now. How do you think that that model has been tried out already in Latin America and is already like something that's been used to justify action against Venezuela, continued the blockade against Cuba, and how do you think that will continue to escalate? I mean, so I see a prime example in the U.S. media already starting to say there's Russian influence in Venezuela. We have to go after them. I think one of Biden's spokespeople were saying we designed these new sanctions to also hit Venezuela and Cuba. So they're already trying to make this connection to go after them as well.
Well, yeah, that's true. They could start, depending how this develops, they could start going after countries that refuse to abide by the US sanctions, which, as I know, because I work on opposing US sanctions on countries, the UN says all sanctions imposed by one country on another country are illegal under international law. The
Right.
only kind of sanctions that are legal in international law are sanctions approved by the United Nations.
Right.
And so US sanctions on Venezuela or Nicaragua or Cuba or Russia or China, it's actually 39 countries that the US has sanctions on. These are illegal under international law. So the US is the country committing the crime there. And that, I'm working on that case to help free Alex Saab, that Venezuelan diplomat who's in prison now in Miami. It's illegal to arrest a diplomat. That violates international law, but he's basically arrested for trying to help Venezuela find ways around the US sanctions. So he's basically arrested for his legal activity, and the US is the one with the illegal activity, but he ends up in jail in Miami. About Cuba and Venezuela, since the Cuba owns the media there, the state, they don't have any right-wing press. They're still going to have social media they get on their phones, which is going to be, US can use that for propaganda purposes, and that's what they did last year. But also, the Cuban people are very, very well educated about the role of the US in trying to overthrow their system. I mean, anybody who's under 60 they've lived under it their whole lives. So they don't need a lot of education about how the US is trying to manipulate things. And they'll listen to and trust what their government tells them. I mean, they're small groups. But one thing that, the blockades do on these countries is it causes a lot of hardship among people. And when you don't think things are going to get better, and it's very frustrating, and life is just difficult all the time, you kind of tend to blame what you see in front of you. You blame your government for not doing more. And that has some impact in Cuba, but not much. In Venezuela, it's much more, because Venezuela, you also still have a lot of right-wing press there. You had a lot of pro-US press there, a lot of pro-US propaganda. So a fair amount of the population actually blame the Venezuelan government for the economic hardships they're going through. And that's a problem. I mean, actually, when the US first imposed sanctions on Cuba, they say, we'll impose hardships on the people in Cuba so that it gets so unbearable, they'll start blaming the government for their problems, and they'll try to get rid of the government. Because they're not going to blame the US, they're going to blame their own governments. And that's what's happens in Venezuela, this fair amount. The people get discontented with their government not meeting their needs. So the US can manipulate them that way. And that way maybe kind of start some color revolution there. Or now that the opposition there is pretty discredited, but that's another problem for the US, to find some opposition that seems kind of legitimate, which they don't have right now. But I was in Venezuela in November. There's a fair amount of people who are confused about what's the role of their government and what's the role of the US government in causing the problems they have. And some of them think, well, it might be better if the US was back in some way. And in
guess
Venezuela, Nicaragua, well, I was there in October. I don't think their government is very popular, regardless of what they say here about him being a
right.
dictator and everything. He is more popular than most of these, probably not more than Cuba, but the other ones, you got like 70% of the vote in the election. I mean, he's very popular, Daniel Ortega. So it'd be
Yeah.
very hard to turn the people against him. I mean, they did try it in 2018 and they fooled some people for maybe a month or two. But then after that, people realized no, the US backed people in Nicaragua are causing all the violence here, and we need to stop it. And then they turned against all that violence, and that was the end of it. And I think people there learned a lesson. It's like you don't trust these opponents of the Sandinistas because they're lying to you.
Mhm.
Plus, they've made tremendous gains in that country in the last 15 years. So
Yeah, I'm interested as well in, on maybe a more optimistic note, as you're talking about making gains in these struggles. Where do you see more progress in forming bonds between the ALBA countries, between the emerging countries that are at least trying to get rid of their previously American loyal neocolonial government? So, what is the general progress, and how is there perhaps maybe on the reverse an opportunity in this crisis for the potential weakening of NATO, as a lot of the statements are talking about a multipolar world potentially emerging in some way. Do you see any cause for optimism in that respect?
well, it'll be a long-term process. I mean, the US is still a major number one superpower in the world. Plus, the US is willing to go to war.
Hmm.
It's like, well, if we kill hundreds of thousands or millions of people to stay on to stay on top of the world, we'll go do it. No
Right.
problem. I don't think China and Russia is like, no, we're not going to do something like that. Um, so that's one advantage that the US has is they're ruthless.
Yeah.
Um, there was much more cooperation on the ALBA countries when Hugo Chavez was around and there was a price of oil was high. Then
Yeah.
they had a lot of interchange and regional economic integration. And then when the Cuban doctors were going all over to all these countries, like Venezuela, there's still like 25,000, I think.
Yeah.
I guess I don't know how many thousand in Bolivia or Nicaragua. But after the sanctions wrecked the Venezuelan economy, they couldn't they couldn't do that much, just try to survive. Now Venezuela is recuperating slowly. Now their oil production is going back up, and now thanks to the war in Ukraine, the oil price of gas has gone way up. So Venezuela has more funds and they're more self-sufficient in agricultural production. But it's these little countries are it's very difficult. And even then was like most people don't know what the SWIFT system is, you know, that international banking system that the US
Right.
controls. Like most of the money used in the world to make international trade is a euro or the dollar, mostly the dollar.
Right.
Even China, majority of its trade is in, even I think up to a year ago, half of its trade with Russia was in the euro or dollar. So it's very hard to get out of that system. And when the US controls that, I mean, it's like every time you go buy something on the internet, or every time you go to the store to buy something, or do anything with money, have a bank account, it's all under the control of the SWIFT system.
Mhm.
And if the US just wants to shut you out of it, then, well, if it shut you or me out of it right now, then the
Yeah.
only money we would have access to is the money that we have in our wallets and or in our pockets. We wouldn't have access to our bank accounts or credit cards or nothing. And so to really get a more multipolar world, you have to have a financial system that is not under such control by the US. It
Right.
has absolute control over it.
Yep.
So maybe what the US is doing to Russia now is forcing these countries, now it's forcing a big country to get out of the SWIFT system because they're sanctioning Russian banks. And if Russia and China developed their own international financial and trade system that was not dependent on the SWIFT system, then the US would have a really big problem controlling the world. But that's not very easy to do.
Yeah.
That's a long-term process, and that's a major struggle. And I don't think, like Russia and China, nobody wants to undertake such a major struggle unless they're forced to do it. Like
Right.
Russia's now forced to do it. You could have done it a long time ago, but it didn't. And
Yeah.
I'm sure,
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I'm sure China someday will be forced to do it, but they haven't done it yet. Because even most of their trade is in the dollar.
Yeah. Yeah, and on this note of, I think, dollar hegemony, the US ability to be the world reserve currency, how do you think that the US application of really like lethal methods of war from NATO as this new kind of like defender of dollar hegemony that has even put, other European countries, even though the EU is at the behest and supports this system, there was a little bit of like an internal divide initially within this coalition between the US and Germany, for example, of Germany saying with its close energy relations with Russia not being entirely willing to go ahead with this. So is there an opportunity for this internal divide? And how do you think, also on that note, that energy is also still very much a present factor in this crisis, and that obviously, as you were talking about with oil prices, is very relevant for a country like Venezuela?
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the I've read some articles that what the US is trying to get out of this war in Ukraine is to cut ties between Europe and Russia.
Right.
I think Europe was getting 40% of its gas from Russia, which is much cheaper than they could get it from anywhere else because they're right next door and it just comes by pipelines. Now they're going to have to get their gas, I guess, from the United States through ships.
Right.
It's going to make it more expensive. Of course, that benefits the US,
Exactly.
but that just means that all the countries in Europe are now subsidizing US economy by doing that. And I think, it's not only was the US trying to control Russia or do something against Russia with this war, it was trying to get all the European Union countries more obedient to the US, more under the control of the US. Is like, no, you're not going to get too close relations with Russia or China. We're going to force you to follow what we say. But what will happen? Prices of gas has already gone up a lot here. The inflation here is going up, and it's going to be going up more since the price of everything, gas and diesel, is going to go up, and everything is trucked in from somewhere. Prices are going to go up all over. So what's going to happen in response to this? It's not, people won't feel it immediately, but they're going to start feeling it's like, wow, this is supporting this war on the Ukraine is really costing us a lot. Maybe we shouldn't be doing it. Maybe we should be more concerned about, raising the minimum wage or lowering the price of housing or doing something about global warming or healthcare or something. Why are we wasting billions of dollars on a war and all we get for it is inflation? I'm not sure although I answered your question.
Well, you definitely did with respect to Europe, but I'm curious about how that then affects the Alba nation, specifically Venezuela, with this push for greater US control of energy, really like you're saying, trying to cut Russia off with respect to energy. How does that tactic apply to Venezuela as a large oil producer as well?
I don't know. That might benefit Venezuela because the price of oil is going up. Russia can't sell its oil on the international market like it could. So maybe there'd be more of a market for Venezuelan oil again. But how it affects Russia, I'm not sure how much China has said it will start buying a lot of Russian oil and gas. I don't know if it's going to really make up for what Russia is losing by selling.
Right.
I I think it's only make 15 or 20% of what they would be losing. But how would it affect? It's not going to affect Cuba.
Yeah.
I don't know if they get much Russian oil. I think their oil comes from Venezuela and Nicaragua. They're like almost what 80 or 90% into renewable energy. So oil is not a big thing there. And then Bolivia is a big producer of gas. So I'm not sure how they would be that affected. And anyways, right next to Bolivia is Ecuador, which is an oil producer. So it might not have oil itself might not have an effect there.
Well, I think it'll be interesting to see how that develops more. And I'm curious, I guess, as kind of a final question in wrapping up about the prospects of Alba as an example, as you're talking about it, doesn't have the same level of cooperation as it used to have when Hugo Chavez was alive. But do you see this model of Alba as this kind of uh, supranational regionalist alliance for development of a particular socialist character as a potential model for, I think, the term that has been developing of South-South cooperation within the global South as a unit of analysis? How do you see that as a model that other nations worldwide and in the rest of the global South could potentially use, and what are the pros and cons of an approach like that?
Well, I think the level of cooperation in Alba countries now, I mean, it's probably the same level of cooperation. The problem is they have much fewer resources now than they did 15 years ago to do things. But the level of cooperation, I mean, Cuba has thousands of doctors in Africa. So there is very close relations with, I mean, they have the history of they're helping overthrow the apartheid in Southern Africa. So, I mean, even had sent troops to go fight against the French in Algeria in the early 60s. So, not our doctors, I forget which, maybe both. So they have a long-term cooperation with Africa, and Hugo Chavez started very close cooperation with the African countries. And both of them say we are Afro countries. Like we're not Latino. We're like Hugo Chavez said that, I'm part African. Um, so there's close relations already between them. It depends how you'd have to have economic powers there that could cooperate that um, for it to really mean much more than just like sending doctors or something. The only other, or I mean, Cuba also has their international school well, not just International School of Medicine, but they have a lot of students from African countries that come there to study for free, medicine and other things. Um, Venezuela's closest cooperation is with Iran, which Iran really helped Venezuela restart all its oil industries because I guess because of its sanctions, it doesn't use American equipment, I guess, for its oil industry. So it helped Venezuela switch from non-American equipment, and I guess Russia did too. The real problem would be like what countries that have some economic weight are in cooperation with Venezuela and Cuba. Well, see, Nicaragua doesn't have much economic weight anyways. Well, Cuba's economic weight is really maybe in its high level of education of its population, that they can send people abroad to help train, or it's great number of doctors it has to send around. But Venezuela has a lot of economic weight based on its oil, and it has a lot of gold. And so it could, I'm not sure, like, you'd have to have, it really had, it seems like the ones that countries they have closest relationships with are the ones that are also in the same position vis-a-vis United States as they are. So, which would means like once the US puts these countries in this pariah position, it's like, we're not dealing with you, then they turn to the other ones in the same position and work closer, basically because that's the only choice they have.
Yeah.
So you could say, well, it's only, I don't know if I'd want to say it, but maybe you could argue that, well, they're cooperating because they don't see that they have any alternative. Well, maybe that's part of it. I mean, Venezuela was also closely cooperating with Libya, but then US overthrew the government and Gaddafi. That's another problem, is that US, any government that is cooperating with a country like Venezuela, the US is, or Iran or something, the US is out to overthrow them.
Yeah.
And the US is pretty effective still at overthrowing governments. So
Right.
they could have good relations with one country, and then all of a sudden the counter-revolutionaries are in power in that country. Like that's what happened in Bolivia for a year. It's the amount of power the US has in the world is still pretty, it's pretty hard to deal with for a lot of countries.
Right.
And I mean, I think the US is still weakening, but it still has an immense amount of power.
Yeah.
But I don't know, it also kind of depends, like, is there some upsurge in world movements? Like, I mean, I was young when the 60s happened. There was a mass upsurge of people around the world. And then I was around when the war in Iraq started. There's a mass upsurge of people around the world then. I mean, all over, millions all over in every country. Now we don't see that really.
Yeah.
And that's really going to be the basis for any kind of big social change, is when masses of people are out in the streets protesting or fighting against something. And that'll help governments in a great deal become more independent of the US.
Right.
But as long as people are staying mostly quiet, it's harder for these other countries to defend for themselves. It's like the response to the war on Russia and the Ukraine that is happening now compared to what Bush was trying to do with the war in Iraq. It's like, wow, this is like 100% reversal among the American population.
Yeah.
back then it's like, couldn't find anybody to say, yeah, you could find some people who were, yeah, let's go to war with Iraq. That's a great idea. But now people are like, yeah, we got to do something against Russia.
Right.
I mean, that's a very successful propaganda campaign by the
Oh
US.
yeah,
A major turnaround in 20 years. Like,
for
wow,
sure.
this is, I might have thought back then there, oh, this is a big decisive change in how American people think, but no. US
Yeah.
turned it around, shows what
Right.
kind of power they have by their control of the media and
Yeah.
uh,
No, I totally agree, and I think it's very frustrating to watch. As you were talking about before, a lot of progressive-minded people accepting a lot of the rhetoric, becoming in favor of NATO, becoming in favor of the US. But I think it speaks to the fact that there's a general, I mean, even when you look at like stuff with Venezuela and Cuba, there's been this long ongoing demonization of those countries that has just led to a general ability to view US intervention as the only possible solution to the problem, and the problem which has been fabricated by the US media in that case. But it is dangerous to observe a lot of these things and to try and call them out, um, and to try and to try and center a message against NATO, against the United States, is not very popular with a lot of people. So I think in that respect, trying to make that the focus of action uh, may not be popular right now, but hopefully as people observe the way the US is going to react to this, the way the US will escalate and has been escalating things to this point and will use it to its advantage. My hope is that people can change their mind and take a more committed anti-NATO position on it. But yeah, I think it'll be difficult to undo a lot of the propaganda that people have embraced.
yeah, that's true, sort of. But I mean, I've been doing for anti-war work for a while, and people's support for what the US is doing is like very thin.
Right,
And once you ask a couple questions or you give them a little information, they said, oh, I didn't know that.
right,
Then it's like, well, then maybe my support for it is like, it's, it'll dissipate.
yeah,
I mean, it's not some great, you know, heartfelt support,
yeah,
got to go volunteer and fight for freedom or something in
right.
Ukraine.
Hmm.
It's a very thin support that they have. It's like a veneer on people.
Right,
And if you get to talk to them and raise certain things with them and ask some questions and make them think about something, then they're like, well, yeah, I guess you have very good points. We
right,
shouldn't be doing what we're doing.
right,
But that's the main reason the US tries to control the media so that people don't have the opportunity they don't ask questions because they only see one story. But however much people go along with these wars, it's like really the support for it is very thin.
right, right. And hopefully with this situation, and as you're relating it to the Alba nations and thinking about a hope that there will be a relation in people's mind to what the US has been doing against Venezuela, against Cuba for decades now in Cuba's case, but especially more recently adding Venezuela to this blockade and attempted interference, attempted coups, especially. Hopefully, there's people making a connection in their mind that the U.S. Encirclement, the NATO expansion and escalation is related. It's related to this, as you're talking about, this campaign to preserve dollar hegemony and American dominance.
Yeah. And there's also the problem that people don't think they could do much.
Right.
I remember my brother-in-law would tell me, well, you go out to all these anti-war demonstrations. Have you ever stopped any wars by doing that?
Right.
Says, I don't support the wars, but I don't think they're not going to stop. So
Right.
I'd rather go fishing. It's like, well, okay. But you think even here is like most of the people in the United States support, single payer or healthcare for everybody, or, cut the, do something about significant about global warming. It's like nothing we try works.
Right.
So that's the problem people have is like, well, I don't have any confidence that if I try to do something to change things, that it's really going to amount to anything. There's just going to be a waste of my time, which is another thing that the US government tries to do, is to make sure any kind of social struggle is not successful. Any kind of union struggle is not successful, because they think, well, if people see if you fight and you win over here, then they're going to start saying, well, maybe if we, other people over here is like, well, if they did it, then we can do it. And then that'll start. I mean, that's how all the whole 60s started, with all these social movements. Is like, well, these people fight and they're doing something, and they're accomplishing something. So we should do that too. That'll inspire a lot of people. Like a lot of workers now don't go on strike because they don't think they're going to win much.
Yeah.
But if they start to think, well, we fight, and they see some big strike that fights and they win, then I think that have a big effect on the US population. That's another big fear of the US government, is as long as people feel like atomized and demoralized, and then nothing they can really do is going to change anything, just vote for this other Democrat or this Republican or whatever, then they have control on the situation. But if people start getting active and doing things, then they become very worried.
Right.
Even like in Canada with the truckers thing in Ottawa, it's like they were very worried. It's like, well, what if other people start thinking, wow, these truckers did that, even though some of their demands are kind of, I don't really agree with, but these guys stood up and fought for something, and they kind of got a fair amount of what they wanted. Government didn't really admit it there, but they rescinded a lot of these vaccine mandates, and they're doing it here.
Yeah.
So I think that's a worry that the US government has, to make sure that no struggle becomes successful, because it'll inspire other people. And if that starts to grow, then they're going to be in very big trouble.
Right. And I think too, you take that's an individual level, but similar on an international level, when there is an alternative country working outside of the US sphere of influence, that similarly proves that people outside the US orbit can do things independently. They don't need the US controlling them. They don't need the US dominating them. And that is a huge concern to the US.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, I could see that certainly when I went to China. Last time I went to China is 2019 in the spring. And I've been all over Europe and Canada and all other places. But that's the first time I went to a country where I thought, wow, this country is more developed than the United States.
Right.
This makes the United States look like a third world country.
Yeah.
Every major city has a brand new subway system. They have high-speed trains that go across the country in like 11 hours.
Yeah.
They have like even things like public toilets everywhere. They have all these things. Is like, wow, we don't have any of this stuff here. And all this stuff is new and modern. It's like, wow. It's like they're like way ahead of the US. It's kind of, and they're getting faster ahead of the US. It's
Right.
like what something Jimmy Carter I said. You think, well, U.S. spent like what do you say, like $3 trillion on wars in the last 30 years, and
Mhm.
China, or 40 years, and China didn't have any wars. They spend that money on their infrastructure. That's why
Right.
they got what they got, and we have what we have here. It's
Right.
because now that's one country is like it's like getting way ahead of the United States.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I unfortunately have to go.
I,
But it was a pleasure talking to you, and I'm
yeah, I like
really
talking to you
curious
too.
to continue the conversation and follow what's going to be happening with the Alba nations in respect, and just in general what the implications of this crisis will be with NATO and the United States and waning US hegemony. But it'll definitely be something to monitor in the next in the years to follow, um, how this impacts Latin America and generally the nations of the global South as well.
Well, yeah, you might, if you do interviews, maybe, because there's a lot of webinars, like on monthly webinars on Nicaragua, and maybe every 2 months on Venezuela, and there's probably more than monthly on Venezuela and Cuba from all different
Mhm.
kinds of organizations. So you could also look up who speaks on those and who you like for a speaker, and have some of those, interview some of those people too.
For sure, yeah. Yeah, I'm definitely going to continue. And there are other students who want to do interviews and learn more as well. So definitely going to continue doing them. But thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and stay well in this crazy world.
Uh, I don't know if any of you, have you ever gone to Venezuela or Cuba or Bolivia or Nicaragua?
I haven't personally, no. I grew up in South Florida, so I knew a decent amount. But obviously in South Florida, it's like a totally different perspective on everything, and you kind of have to meet people who
Uh,
are willing to challenge the mainstream discourse. But just from meeting a lot of people and learning the alternative narrative from the US, it was really eye-opening to see how people actually thought about, an alternative to the United States and a challenge to US hegemony. So I haven't been there, but I would love to someday and further learn about what my friends were telling me about, those who were not really compelled by the US narrative of things.
well, I know there's a lot of trips, delegations of activists who go to Cuba. There's the Pastors for Peace caravan. I know
Right.
there's a May Day delegation that's going. And then Nicaragua has the Friends of the ATC that has a lot of young people go on those delegations. And I've gone on some of them, and I thought I was going to work with some and then Massachusetts Peace Action and me here in Chicago to help raise money to send students to go on those trips who wouldn't have the money but have the time, and they're young and they'd be a new generation of activists to go. If any of you there would be interested in that sometime.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be incredible. Let's definitely stay in touch on that, because I know a bunch of people
Yeah,
who would be
you
that
got
I would
my
personally.
email. So
Yeah, yeah. I'm gonna continue the dialogue, and when more information is available on that, let me know and I'll disseminate it to the students that we have in our group. And I would love to pursue that as well, because I really would like to travel to Cuba at some point. So yeah, definitely keep me updated on that.
all right. Well, I think in the bottom of that, those emails I sent you, those Venezuela Alba Solidarity,
Mhm.
I do list delegations to those countries. So you can see if you wanted to go on any,
Awesome. Yeah, I'm gonna take a look
and
at
if
those.
you
And yeah,
need any, if you're hard up for money, I could, or me and other people could help donate so you could go.
yeah,
I've
that would
been
be
enough.
fantastic. Yeah. That would be
Yeah,
incredible.
because
And
then
we
we thought,
actually,
well, we
yeah,
help pay for some students to go, and then they come back and speak to their school and speak to the people and then wherever they live about what they saw.
right.
So,
And we also like doing these interviews. We like doing them on Zoom online, but it'd be even cooler to go and interview people face to face and get their perspective and record it. We're
oh
trying to
yeah,
basically just record as many conversations as we can that are outside of the mainstream. So that would be fantastic.
oh, okay, all right.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much again, and stay well. I'll keep in touch.
All right, yeah, thanks for contacting me about this. How did you find out about me?
I was reading Monthly Review has I guess they have like they collect articles from different sources, and I think I saw an article of yours on the Monthly Review website. So I was
Oh,
contacting people on Monthly Review.
yeah, I recently wrote one on Nicaragua. I think they put the gains of women in Nicaragua. Okay,
Well, great. Yeah, thanks so much, and take care.
okay, yeah, thanks for
Bye.
having me on. Bye.
Thanks so much.